our physiology, or in any physiology, you know, as was said, the table is a table is a table. What is it about that expression that allows it to be free to be a table? So self-determined action can be experienced as a consequence of natural necessity, and the intention of evolution is to provide the foundations of free action. So this requires a certain amount of understanding, in that sense that the emergent evolution, that we can read intentionality in evolution, and that there is cooperation in evolution, are kind of precursors to understanding where Steiner is coming from. So to base freedom on philosophical, spiritual, and psychological arguments can leave us full of questions or doubts as to the practical evidence of freedom. And can we, through the physiological conception of freedom, find some practical applications? So that would mean the functions and mechanisms of the human being, in other words, physiology, the functions and mechanisms of the human being and other living organisms, would need to have an evidence-based relationship to natural or cosmic law. Universal necessity has produced a part of our being, or a being's being, that allows for the emancipation of such laws, establishing a place for free action. So that's what I'm going to try and do during this talk, is to address that. With that, I think it's really important, as I've said, to understand Rudolf Steiner, who was an early 20th century philosopher 100 years ago. And his philosophy really bases itself in really understanding that spiritual beings work into matter through consciousness. So the Trinity creates through a hierarchy, the Dionysian hierarchies, the 9 ranks of angels, which are centered in the Elohim, and the Christ is centered in the Elohim. Creation is similar to that of taught by origin, which is the condensation of mind. So again, consciousness precedes matter, and through evolution, there is intentionality, and its focus is to create freedom, free will, and therefore we need to find that where we are free and where we are not free, because we can't say it's either or. There are places where we are determined and places where we can express freedom. And what does that actually mean? So Steiner's way proceeds from thinking. He built a system of knowledge and an idea of freedom found on the Pauline worldview, purely out of the world of ideas and concepts. Paul did not create a theory of knowledge, but a theological anthropology based on the first and the second Adam. It creates the Christological basis for Steiner to say that his epistemology is one which restores the unity of reality which has been lost. So in his Ph.D., in his doctoral thesis in the 1880s, this act of restoration consists in thinking about the world as given, so it's empirical. Our thinking consideration of the world brings about the actual union of the 2 parts of the world content. The part we survey as given on the horizon of our experience, the phenomenon, and the part which has to be produced in the act of cognition before that can be given also. The act of cognition is the synthesis of these 2 elements. So the noumenon and the phenomenon coming together in consciousness. That's the basis of human knowledge. Indeed, every single active condition, one part appears as something produced within the act itself, and through the act as added to the merely given. This part, in actual fact, is always so produced and only appears as something given at the beginning of epistemological theory. So again, a little bit in earlier things, the thing we can't actually, in the epistemology, we can't observe ourselves while reading. We have to sort of stop reading and then observe ourselves. And in Steiner's sense, we have a self that is actually our everyday self, but we also have a transcendent self, different to Sartre in that sense, I think. So Steiner talks about this. He wrote a book, what he considers to be his seminal work, The Philosophy of Freedom. And I'm going to address this in 3 parts now. So the first part will be to address what is a philosophy of freedom, or Steiner's philosophy of freedom. What does he mean by that? And then the second part will be to look at what a physiology of freedom would mean in the economy of creation, or and the whole, what physiology is it, what physiology is required for freedom to be true. And then the third part, I'll try and look a little bit of some applications for it in science and theology. That's my intention. Let me see if we can do that. Yeah. So the philosophy of freedom. This is Steiner from his book. Is the human being in thinking and acting a spiritually free being? Or are we compelled by the iron necessity of purely natural law? Steiner, I call a thing free, which exists and acts from the pure necessity of its nature. My words, therefore a table is free because it acts in its nature as a table. Steiner, and I call that unfree, of which the being and action are precisely and fixedly determined by something else. And that's an interesting kind of statement. Where am I precisely and fixedly determined by something else? This for Steiner is both external, so natural law, societal law, community law, church law, or rules, but also to do with the internal self. So where my history, my memories, my trauma, my desire, my passions, my wishes determine my action, my fears, all these things leave me unfree. So how can we, in this sense, come to a free, what ethical techniques or technology, moral technology do we need to develop to be able to free ourselves from external and internal necessities and fixeds in our nature? So to what extent can the human being or any creature, so, a lion or a dog, a tree, be considered free? So self-determined action can be experienced as a consequence of natural necessity. And the intention of evolution is to provide the foundations for free action. And this is Steiner's, I suppose, central definition of what that double-edged sword means. So to live in love towards our actions. And I think that's where Steiner, out of all the things that I've read, this is where Steiner brings something quite interesting into freedom, the love towards an action. So an action is free if I love it. And we can explore some of that. And then, however, this is the community side, and to let live in understanding the other person's will. So to live in love towards my own action and to let live in the understanding of the other person's will. So when I understand another person's will, I can let it live in the world. So again, a cognitive process of, this thing of talking, dialoguing with the other person to understand why they're doing what they're doing. For Steiner, that's the fundamental principle of the free human being, to live in love towards our actions and to let live in the understanding the other person's will. So love is a central context of the evolution of freedom. Implicitly asks for an evolution of love and therefore morality. So the evolution of freedom, love, and morality. And that's is really important because we often think that certain things remain the same and have always been the same. So I know certainly in my conversations with a lot of people, love evolves. The issue whether we are essentially selfish or essentially good has become superseded by our capacity to determine for ourselves which of those we want to bring to fruition. So here we are partly determined by our nature, natural law, which culminated in our capacity to think, discern, judge, and make a choice of action. So the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the choice between those two, that emerged through evolution, that capacity. It wasn't always something that was just there to the extent that it is now. So we are partly guided, if not determined, by the structures of our societal agreements and bound to learning how to act through society's methods of curtailing our antisocial behavior. So society acts, church society, secular society acts as a way of schooling the internal drives and passions and the whole ethical approach to things. However, for Steiner, we're at a third stage of development where ethical individualism starts to direct action outside of those two parameters. So in his philosophy of freedom, he talks very clearly about there's these three first initial things that determine our will. We are first determined by natural law, and some of us still is, you know, at the micro level, even at the level of having to eat. All those things are, you know, things that if we challenge them, we will probably remain or lose our incarnation. We then, as consciousness evolves, we also then start to structure society, and we see how that is guided. There are guiding beings who help structure society for, in a way, the ennoblement of the ethical life. Many of the texts that we read, the biblical texts, the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, can be read as teaching humanity in their local communities to at first, you know, refine themselves and then start to change their moral, ethical dispositions. I'll come to that towards the end of how that works better. So we can develop can we develop a civil obedience? So a civil obedience, not a civil disobedience, where what we love becomes an obligation or duty to do the best for what we love. So if I am free by my nature, if I become free to be determined by my nature only, I can only really be free if I choose that action out of love, for Steiner. And what value would best promote such a moral imagination? So the moral imagination that I can be free within the constraints of my community to the agreed things. But if I'm just doing it out of duty or under some duress, we talked about coercion, wooing, all those sorts of things, you're no longer free. So the key for Steiner for me to do my duty would be to be able to love what I'm doing, because I've put this down. I've made the confines of my action within those boundaries. And those don't always have to be in a community. Of course, you know, the ethical individualism brings us to an edge of where you can then just create your own world and, you know, a post-truth world and create your own little universe, which then kind of becomes counterproductive to letting the will of the other be in understanding it. So where might we start? Where might we start to find this will to allow my actions to be done out of love? So the love for the action, my love for the action is what makes me free, not my obligation to an agreed behavior code, not my obligation to my passions, my drives, my desires, my wishes. That doesn't mean they become irrelevant. That doesn't mean we have to sacrifice them or get rid of them. But we have to be able to go through a refinement process to make sure that we're not being, that our morality is not being determined by those things, or our ethical behavior is not being determined by those things. So a place to start in sort of contradistinction to some of other things is an appeal to the transcendent good might be a place to start. So that's where I go with this. How is what is good determined by human beings, society, and codes of moral and ethical behavior? Or is goodness something that is inherent spiritually in our humanity, which we can access? So Steiner would suggest that that's slightly different. And I've written a paper which I've presented before here, developing the epistemological faculties to experience God's agency and intention. I think I did that at the Otago conference. So I would suggest that there is a transcendent good, and it is inherent in how God directs humanity. We can infer God's will in evolution by finding the good for our actions, and by finding the good for our actions, we feel this intention. This goodness beyond ourselves can be accessed regardless of our philosophical or theological framing. At the same time, trying to define this good in moral codes is increasingly difficult to formulate and maintain in the time of an ethical individualism. It might be argued that to define goodness more philosophically or from the standpoint of humanism without a theological reference to God is better for the restructuring of society through ethical individualism in the Anthropocene. So there's an interface there. Sarah Bacallard, who's in Canberra, suggests that in a Christian context, we can grasp a better shape of reality to the proper background to morals and free action by articulating and elaborating the nature of the transcendent good. It makes a difference to our lived experience if we explore it in the light of a specific theological revelation of the story of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So it makes a difference to our lived experience if we explore our access to the transcendent good, if it's posited in the revelation of the story of the death and resurrection of Christ. The moral imagination derived from focusing on the life of Christ, a resurrection ethic as a wisdom ethic is based on, and this is Bacallard, quote Bacallard, the apostolic testimony that the nature of transcendent reality experienced in the light of resurrection is inexhaustibly forgiving and hospitable. It is alive in a way that is not shaded by death, loving in a way not shaded by violence. It is self-possessing, liberating, and reconciling, and offers human beings the possibility of participating in that dynamic and to project this divine life. It thereby reveals that becoming like and animated by this life is our access to becoming fully who we are. So there's a kind of a way that we can draw upon something that inspires us and is a source, so to say, of ethical motivation. It's an important aspect of moral imagination to shift the values of our ethical choices away from the limitation of trying to avoid death to knowing that we live in the life of Christ and that our principles are derived from this perspective. Our principles and values, this is George Monbiot, who is a great writer at the moment, in The Guardian often, our principles and values are maintained by the stories we tell ourselves and believe. That's from his book, Out of the Wreckage, a new politics for the age of crisis. So we tell ourselves stories, and the story of Christ, and especially the story of there is life beyond resurrection, there's life beyond death, allows us to access an archetypal source, a transcendent good that allows us to base our sort of free action, our love for our action, not in the codes and in the natural law of our bodies, but not just in the social codes, but also in these principles of being inexhaustibly forgiving and hospitable. It's not shaded by violence. It's not shaded by death. It's not overshadowed by the lens of death and resurrection. The rescue story of redemption. There's more to the Christ's work in the world than just rescuing a messed up job of humanity. That's one aspect, an important part, but it can be bigger than that. So Bacallard says the story of Jesus Christ frames a moral imagination that has values such as life, love, forgiveness, reconciliation, and hospitality to project this divine life into our world, and that is who we really are. And as you can see, you don't have to be a Christian to be able to access those things. So using such words as transcendent good, for a Christian, we might say, living in the imitation of Jesus, not only the imitation of Christ, but also the imitation of the life of Jesus, takes it away from, we can't be like Jesus because he lived 2,000 years ago. But these are transcendent values that he gave us to be able to focus that upon. So Bacallard again, through Christ, the good changes from a distant, unaffected by our strivings idea to participating in it as the essence of the living God. So this is where that transcendent idea and the immanent participating in the essence comes about. So, the incarnation, the word became flesh, is essentially about the word becoming incarnate and going through an evolutionary process in the human being towards projecting these values into our deeds through love. So through Christ's sacrifice, God enters our world and invites us to share in the abundance of the divine life. So this is something quite important in Steiner's work, that there's this, in a way you could say, I don't know where one would place that, but it's certainly probably in the Gnostic realm, is that we need to access through our ideas. We could call it theosis. I think Krista called it flourishing, but the theosis, where the becoming more spiritual, the more divine within ourselves through the work of the human being, by fulfilling ourselves in these transcendent ideas of the good, becoming ethical individualism. So ethical individualism and moral imagination born in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ are the capacities that, as emergent evolution through freedom, learn to love beyond natural necessity. So a way of experiencing that would be to see the evolution of love in itself. It would have been, a few thousand years ago, where the natural necessity of blood, tribe, family, race determined who we could love, also our feelings for love. Yeah. Whereas as we progress, that has changed, and we now are able to extend our sense of love, in the sense of Steiner's definition of freedom, to be able to understand another person's will and let that live in love. So we are able to now, not just marry within the tribe. We become to consanguinity. We're not in, only marrying within prearranged tribal lineages. That changed, with the Ptolemies. That was kind of the time where that changed at the end of the Egyptian reign, just before the Roman pharaohs took over, and then all those things started to open up, where the role of changing the love based in our genetics and our natural law of genetics and blood has been given an impulse. And Steiner would argue that that impulse was given through the Christ entering into the human body. So his theory of evolution would state that new things come into evolution, emerge in evolution, because consciousness acts within the human soul. And there are great beings, Christ being one of them, who through history, so like Krishna, Buddha, have come and have brought impulses in a particular moment that then humanity must learn to unfold within themselves. And in that way, we cooperate in evolution by evolving our capacity for freedom, love, and morality. So as Robert Pirsig said, Robert Pirsig of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance said in his book, Lila, he said, in the end, it comes to treating the word good as a noun. So as a motifier ethical behavior. It's not a verb, it's a noun. So if we can treat what is the being of good epitomized through the capacity opened in humanity through the action of Christ. Not that we didn't love or have certain freedoms before that, but it was given a certain impulse, another impulse in the evolution of consciousness. We were aided in that. In Steiner's language, he would say that's partly not just the redemption of the human being, but it's also the restoration of our original paradisical self. So there's a connection to all of that. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the physiology of freedom. So how do we gain access to the life of the transcendent good made available to us through Christ? How does theosis in Christ work today when individualism is the emerging field of moral action? I suggest that the spiritual understanding of the nature of the human being is required. For Steiner, this theosis is a personal experience of the transcendent good, which is universal and personal at the same time. Human beings can undertake intentional inner work to develop a higher sensorium, or the spiritual senses, that develop completely through spiritual, what he calls a spiritual chemistry. The work is to be done is inner work and effort in soul and spirit based on powers we actually have and use in our everyday life that need to be enhanced if they are to be used to gain insight into the realm of spirit. The human being has evolved under the guidance of the spiritual world's imagination of a universal humanity. For Steiner, that's, correlates with the inner dreaming intention of the Trinity guides through the hierarchies this process. I mean, Sartre would say we doomed to freedom. Steiner would say we're destined to freedom. We haven't yet had the physiological basis. So the physiological basis for developing freedom requires us to develop perceptions and thought that are not reliant, but are developed out of the forces inherent in our body. So the spiritually understood physiological basis means that the functions and mechanism of the human being and other living organisms would need to have an evidence-based relationship between natural law and the cosmic laws. A spiritual conception of human physiology, the study of the functions, mechanisms, and structures of our organism, can be the basis for understanding how freedom, love, and morality work as the motivational forces in our ethical life. So for Steiner, I'm going to paraphrase this because time's marching on. Steiner sees that the Christ being has worked through evolution to bring about three capacities in the human body through evolution that create freedom. The one is to stand upright, which gives us the freedom of our hands. And based on the uprightness of the human being, the faculty of speech, and then thought that emerges from speech. In other words, we learn to speak first. If you look at human life, we learn to imitate words, and eventually we learn to think. And then through thinking, we can, through speech, bring about new ideas and act and think and create motivation beyond that which is determined by our sort of natural law determined physiology only. So these three capacities, to stand upright, to learn to talk, and expressing our thoughts in language, are the first three physiological capacities in humanity that forms the basis of human freedom, which is, then gives us the capacity for ethical individualism, which requires something new today. So I'm not going to go too much further on that again. But now these three capacities of the human physiological basis require to be developed for ethical individual moral imaginations. So we raise them through theosis, and we will develop selflessness in love. So selflessness is a very big part of Steiner's language. It's what he, the theosis, the imitation of Jesus is the road to selflessness, to be able to allow that love to come about. So for Steiner, the moral development of human beings depends upon themselves emptying themselves of selfish tendencies epitomized in Christ emptying his blood as a symbol to contemplate, so a contemplative symbol for the necessary process of becoming selfless in any given aspect of our development. Moving along. So whereas initially in the development of humanity, these qualities of freedom, love, and morality, of human dignity were under the guidance of natural law. So we were under the guidance of natural law in our freedom, love, and morality, and then societal codes. We now see them being held through the development of higher soul capacities of individuals. It is also necessary to say that it is possible for ethical choices of the individual can descend into the whims of personal desire, wishes, and self-serving activity. That's the issue, obviously, that how do we prevent that? And that's where the moral development at this point is quite interesting for us to consider, that it requires a certain amount of moral development to be able to take the step into ethical individualism. That then in Steiner's language, once we start acting as moral individuals or ethical individuals, we will collaborate in new forms of communities, so that there's a breaking down of old communities through ethical individualism, and then free acts of associating together in new ways together. So how does this apply to science and theology? I realize I'm heading into overtime. So one of the ways to do this is to say it is difficult to offer an individual interpretation of what is good out of a personal connection to the living good, without thinking that the good must be universal and the same for everyone. So is a universal or transcendent good the same for everyone if I have a personal connection to it? And how do we work with that theologically? This creates the possibility of nullifying the capacity for ethical individualism. I suggest that the path of science and theology can offer individuals is to reframe our path of knowledge into an applied science and an applied theology. This path shifts our focus from the philosophy of science and the philosophy of theology to lived experience, or the relational. So the relational God of Stanley Grenz, or we've talked about the relational capacities that have emerged over since Immanuel Kant reformed Aristotle's categories. Bulgakov, we've all been talking about the relational God. The good is, or the essence of the living God is made present in relationship. So the ethical individualism is mediated through relationship. And this, I think, is shown theologically in the development from the Mosaic law to the Sermon on the Mount. So the law given through Christ, which is not to replace the law, but to fulfill it, epitomized, how does God's voice guide us through great leaders? In Moses, the voice of God was heard, of Yahweh was heard as, I will be what I will be. And there were commandments given, so an external code that guided us, not as a thou shalt not, but you will one day not be able to, you will become not able to kill, etc., etc. But in Christ's law, so for example, in John 13 says, as you have loved, so should you also love one another. Or a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Or what you do to one of the least of my brethren, you do unto me. He also says in Moses's law, so Matthew 5, he comes under, changes he says, as Moses said, but when when this transcendent good is at work within you, then this will also become true. And it goes through a whole development of changing the ethical behavior of a person. Not only you will not be able to kill, but already when you're angry with someone, you will perceive that you are killing them. So this comes under, in Steiner's language, under the Pauline. I promote this as Steiner's hermeneutical key. The not I, but Christ in me. So my daily I, that is determined by natural law and by societal law, now accessing a higher I am, the Christ. So the Christ epitomizes this higher good that can become completely personal in me. So when not me, but the Christ within me acts, we are in the realm of the Sermon on the Mount. And as John Welch, who in his book, The Sermon on the Mount in the Light of the First Temple Theology says, the whole Sermon on the Mount is a institution of the schooling of ethical individualism through the connection to Christ in us. It's a liturgical, ritual process to develop a higher order of righteousness and consecration. So we can start to see that the teachings of Christ really push us to get beyond the codifications, even though it's a schooling, and you could call it a codification, I understand that, but where we start to see that if you undertake this process, we need to go through these steps of the Sermon on the Mount as compared to, say, the Sermon on the Plain. So I just wanted to add one more thing, how that applies in science is I have a friend here in Sydney, Travis Waller, and he is a professor in engineering, and he has discovered that it's no longer okay for engineers just to sign a code of ethics. So they go, well, we sign away this code of ethics and then we can just create technology. And he's going, what he's discovering is that when engineers use the technology they've invented to create infrastructures in cities, they sign away, their liability under codes of ethics. And he's gone, that's no longer enough. He's designing courses now in universities for students and current engineers where they have to go develop a code of ethics where they reflect upon the impact of their infrastructure. So we have to say, I have to, I can create an idea, I can create a theology, I can create a social science, I can create infrastructure, but I also now need to be able to reflect upon what my infrastructure is causing for other people. This is this individualism. I need to become responsible. And I think this is where, Steiner would agree with Sartre, is that I need to become as responsible for my actions. I can't just sign it away behind a scheme. I can't just protect myself through the social structures of, making my life safe by insurance and all these things, but I have to actually take the consequences of my design or idea. I have to reflect upon that, and then so we can't just have an ethical formula in every situation. It requires that ethical individualism and moral imagination born of the good in Christ, or what is humane, if that is a better language, must of necessity require the scientist and the theologian to take personal responsibility for the consequences of their design or their idea. And I might just leave it at that because I've run out of time. There might be a few more things to say there. I'll just finish off with this last thing. The edge of technological, scientific, and social engagement from individual moral imagination, which implies taking personal responsibility through communal support, is where human culture will advance into being morally developed enough to engage with technology and scientific process, which also engages with life. We have to develop, or we will need to develop enough moral capacity and love for all that lives, human, animal, plant, and geographic environments, if our egotism is not to destroy the earth. This is the basis of the philosophy of freedom that can only come from the freedom of the individual physiology to love. This in all senses is Christian ethics and can have many ways of being described without using the word Christ. It is born of the Christ principle in evolution, the love of all in the individual. And then can love be the inner ethical value as the source for new principles in science, theology, religion, and social science? I think that sort of rounds it out. Thank you for listening.